Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, December 5th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Pentagon chief slams American non-interventionists. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has hit out at Americans who prefer a less interventionist foreign policy, smearing them as isolationists who want to see the U.S. retreat from responsibility. So Austin, who is a former Raytheon board member, it's important to point out when we talk about him that right before he took over at the Pentagon, he was sitting on the board of Raytheon, which is one of the largest weapons makers, military contractors in the U.S., and Austin made these comments in a speech at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California on Saturday. And I have to give credit to Ron Paul and Dan McAdams for covering what Austin said in that speech in their show, or I might have missed this. I overlooked these very interesting comments that Austin made. So he said, quote, in every generation, some Americans prefer isolation to engagement, and they try to pull up the drawbridge. They try to kick loose the cornerstone of American leadership, end quote. The Pentagon chief accused less interventionist Americans of trying to, quote, undermine the security architecture that has produced decades of prosperity without great power war, end quote. So it's interesting that he says that there has been no great power war. Well, he's been the one that has overseen this policy, this Ukraine policy of shipping, dumping, billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons into Ukraine to fuel a proxy war with Russia, this great power, this major nuclear power. And primarily, for the most part, most people who are against the U.S. being involved in Ukraine are because it risks a great power war, because it greatly increases the chance of the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia fighting directly, which could quickly turn into a nuclear war. So it's just worth pointing out that he's responsible for all these increased tensions between the U.S. and another great power like Russia. And also, he's also overseeing this huge military buildup over in the Asia Pacific, increasing tensions with China. So in his rhetoric, Austin appeared to be targeting the Republicans in Congress who have opposed additional funding for Ukraine, although the vast majority of GOP members against the proxy war with Russia favor funding Israel's onslaught in Gaza and also the military buildup in Asia. So they have their preferred interventions. Unfortunately, they're not, staunch non-interventionists, although Thomas Massie has been voting, has very well on all the issues. So Austin said, quote, and you'll hear some people try to brand an American retreat from responsibility as bold new leadership. So when you hear that, make no mistake, it is not bold, it is not new, and it is not leadership, end quote. So Austin went on to urge Congress to pass a full-year appropriations bill and to approve President Biden's behemoth $105 billion spending request that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Austin said, quote, our competitors don't have to operate under continuing resolutions, and so doing so erodes both our security and our ability to compete, end quote. It sounds like he's complaining about democracy in the process that Congress goes through to approve funding and to approve funding all these wars overseas. He wants to just do it much quicker, it sounds like. He went on, quote, and I also urge you to pass our urgent supplemental budget request to help fund our national security needs, to stand by our partners in danger, and to invest in our defense industrial base, end quote. So this is common rhetoric now that we see from the Biden administration, that supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia is great for the American defense industrial base. And we'll have more on that in another story, but I just wanted to include this tweet from Massie, who was criticizing this rhetoric from the Biden administration. He wrote on Twitter or X, quote, believe them when they tell you funding these wars is mostly about enriching America's military-industrial complex. The plan is to revitalize the defense industrial base. Ending the war in Afghanistan was tough on profits. Note, DIB is the new Mike, end quote. So DIB is the abbreviation for Defense Industrial Base, and then Mike is the abbreviation for Military Industrial Complex. So I think Massey made a good point there. So definitely interesting to see Austin going after people that are, less interventionist minded than he is, which is, I would say, most people. All right. So the next one here, Senate to vote on Biden's $106 billion military aid bill. So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, has scheduled a vote for Wednesday to advance President Biden's massive $106 billion emergency spending request that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, as well as additional funding for the border. This was reported by Politico. So I said $105 billion in the last story. My math was actually wrong on this bill. I should correct that in the other one. I went through each kind of itemized thing today, and it's a little over $106 billion. I thought I did that before, and it was over 105, but I guess I had it wrong. But this vote is not expected to pass. Republicans have said they would block the request if Democrats do not make certain concessions on border policies. While the bill includes $13.6 billion for border security, the GOP is looking for asylum law changes that would make it more difficult for migrants to enter the country, but a deal has not been reached. So while there's all this funding for border security, the Republicans actually want to tighten up rules and the laws when it comes to people coming in to the country. So Schumer's reasoning for scheduling a vote that will likely fail is to instill a sense of urgency for the Senate to advance funding for the war in Ukraine, Israel's assault on Gaza, and the military buildup aimed at China. Schumer said, quote, "I urge every single senator to think where we are at this moment in history. America's national security is on the line around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific," end quote. So Schumer also announced that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will brief senators in a video conference on Tuesday to make a fresh pitch for the U.S. to continue funding his war with Russia. So to break it down, the $106 billion includes about $61 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, and $7 billion for the Indo-Pacific, and that includes $2 billion in military aid that will go toward. That's expected to mostly go to Taiwan. The Philippines might get a cut of that. It's not really clear yet. But news of Schumer setting up the vote came after the White House sent a letter to congressional leaders pleading to authorize funding for Ukraine because the money is drying up. And that is what this next article is about. And it says that the White House tells Congress it's running out of money to fund the Ukraine war. So the White House sent a letter to congressional leaders warning that it's running out of money to fund the proxy war in Ukraine. And this is from Shalonda D. Young. She's the head of the White House's Office of Management and Budget. She said, quote, "I want to be clear, without congressional action by the end of the year, we will run out of resources to procure more weapons and equipment for Ukraine and to provide equipment from U.S. military stocks. There is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. We are out of money and nearly out of time," end quote. So there actually is a magical pot of money that the Pentagon has, and that is the leftover funds that became available after they discovered an accounting error, a so-called accounting error, that overvalued previous weapons shipped to Ukraine. So that gave them $6 billion to work with. So by my count, they still have around $5 billion of that money, and that's just funding that allows them to ship weapons directly to Ukraine. But without that error, they wouldn't have any money left. So she detailed some of the numbers here. She said, quote, "As of mid-November, DOD has used 97% of the $62.3 billion it received, and state has used 100% of the $4.7 billion in military assistance that it received. Approximately $27.2 billion has been used for economic assistance and the civilian security assistance to Ukraine, which is just as essential to Ukraine's survival as military assistance. State and USAID have used 100% of this amount," end quote. So she's saying everything else is dried up besides a little bit left at the Pentagon. And she's saying that the U.S. has been sending smaller weapons packages for Ukraine because it is running out of funding. And I mentioned she uses that term again, the defense industrial base, basically saying this money is going to give more contracts to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all these defense contractors that are cashing in on this war. Despite all these signs that the war, Ukraine has no chance of winning this war, they're looking to fund it for another entire year through the 2024 election. That's why they want $61 billion, because they don't want to have to worry about trying to get these funds approved again. They're very frustrated by the democratic process in the U.S. All right, so the next one here, getting into the Gaza stuff, which is going to be more depressing. The first one here, Congress sees plan to cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. So Israel Hayom, an Israeli media outlet, reported last week that some members of Congress have reviewed a plan to condition U.S. aid to Arab countries on their willingness to accept refugees from Gaza, which would facilitate the Israeli goal of cleansing the territory of Palestinians. The proposal was shown to key figures in the House and Senate. The report did not say who exactly viewed it, and it also did not say who submitted the proposal, so it's not clear exactly where it came from. I would guess some sort of Israeli. It was the Israelis in some way that probably submitted this idea. So this proposal calls for conditioning aid to Egypt, Turkey, Yemen, and Iraq, and even details how many Palestinians each country should take. The plan proposes that 1 million Palestinians go to Egypt, 500,000 to Turkey, 250,000 to Iraq, and another 250,000 to Yemen. In total, the plan outlines the expulsion of 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, nearly all of the 2.3 million Palestinians that live there. And I'm sure these details, they were just using nice even numbers that they ultimately want all of them to be kicked out. So in October, a document drafted by Israel's intelligence ministry was leaked to the media, and it outlined several proposals for a post-war Gaza. The document said that the best option for Israel would be to expel all the Palestinians in Gaza to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and create a sterile buffer zone in Egyptian territory. And the biggest problem for the Israelis when it comes to this plan is that Egypt is very against the idea. They're refusing to take Palestinian refugees. They're saying they're refusing to allow, a second Nakba. And that, so that is a big problem with these plans, even this plan that was reviewed by Congress, because they want 1 million to go to Egypt. But the argument of this plan is basically, Egypt receives a lot of military aid from the U.S. They're saying condition this stuff, use it as leverage, basically bribe them, maybe I bet they would want Israel would like the U.S. to offer them more money so they take in these Palestinians. And there was also a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from 2 members of the Israeli Knesset calling for Western countries to accept Palestinians. And Israel's intelligence minister, she also penned a similar op-ed for the Jerusalem Post that proposed the voluntary resettlement of Palestinians in Gaza to other countries around the world. So this is a popular idea, and I think it goes to show that it's clear that the Israeli government wants these Palestinians out of there. But the Arab countries, I can't see them getting on board with this. The other big name there is Turkey. They want Turkey to take 500,000. I haven't really covered what Erdogan's been saying, but he has been very, very critical, calling Netanyahu, the butcher of Gaza. So he's not going to want to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. And then when it comes to Iraq, there's all these Shia factions that are, of course, very staunchly against what's happening. And then Yemen, the so-called internationally recognized government of Yemen is not based in Yemen. The Houthis have controlled the capital since 2014, and they control where most Yemenis live. So, who knows what would happen with that. But this is going to be a hard sell for all of these Arab countries. And Turkey is not an Arab country, I know that. But they are part of this plan. All right, so the next one here, Israel bombs areas of South Gaza where it told Palestinians to flee. So Israel intensified airstrikes in southern Gaza on Monday and bombed areas where it told Palestinians to seek shelter. And this was reported by Reuters. Israel ordered the evacuation of parts of the main southern city of Khan Yunis, but residents said areas where they were told to flee were still coming under attack. The Israeli military posted a map on X with arrows pointing from Khan Yunis, telling people to head toward the Mediterranean Sea in the town of Rafah, which is near the Egyptian border. But Rafah has continued to come under Israeli attack. The Reuters report says, quote, bombings at one site in Rafah overnight had torn a crater the size of a basketball court out of the earth. A dead toddler's bare feet and black trousers poked out from under the pile of rubble. Men struggled with their bare hands to move a chunk of the concrete that had crushed the child, end quote. Many of the Palestinians who had to flee to Khan Yunis were in the city after evacuating from northern Gaza, and it's estimated that 1 million Palestinians have been displaced from the north and are now in the south. Dozens of Israeli tanks, armored personnel carriers, and bulldozers entered Khan Yunis on Monday, so things are really ramping up in that city. And the U.S. had warned Israel not to expand its operations in southern Gaza before accounting for the millions of civilians that are there, but it's clear Israel has ignored the U.S. warnings, as Israeli military officials are vowing that the onslaught in the south will be just as bad as in the north. And Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant signaled on Monday that the destruction in the south could be even worse. He said, quote, the IDF has begun to work in the south of the Gaza Strip. The fate of the terrorists in the Hamas battalions there will be the same as those in the north and worse, end quote. So Gaza's health ministry put out another update on Monday and said at least 15,899 Palestinians have been killed so far in Gaza. And they say 70% of the dead were women and children. And the next one here, more journalists killed as Israel resumes military operations in Gaza. This is an article from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. At least 3 Palestinian journalists have been killed in the Israeli onslaught in Gaza since Tel Aviv broke a truce and resumed military operations on Friday. So the General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists told the Associated Press that 3 or 4 journalists have been killed in Gaza since Friday. So I guess there's a 4th that might be missing. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, over 50 journalists have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. It's nearly 60. I mean, it's just a huge number of journalists that are being killed in this war, unprecedented in any modern recent conflict. So they continue to be killed. All right, so this next one here, false claims that a dead Palestinian baby was a doll go viral. So this is an article from Business Insider, and the reason why I wanted to put it up top was because over the weekend, I was actually scrolling Ben Shapiro's Twitter for some reason. I was subjecting myself to that. And I saw him retweet something about some pro-Israel account, tweeted a picture of a guy holding a baby and said, oh, Al Jazeera blurred out this baby saying it was dead, but it's a doll. Look at this picture. And I spent way more time than I would have liked looking at this picture of what I thought was a dead baby. I don't know how anybody thought it was a doll, and I really examined it for a while because the Jerusalem Post actually had a story that said it was a doll. But this article from Business Insider says that the Jerusalem Post retracted that story and that it was just a false claim that it was a doll. It was a dead baby. They said it looked stiff because of rigor mortis set in. And I mean, there's a lot of examples of this sort of misinformation that's going on, but this one just, I don't know. It just really kind of made me angry. So I just thought I would put this up. And the baby's name was Muhammad Hani al-Zahar. He was 5 months old. Journalists had pictures of him. Reuters news agency had images of the baby. So, it's confirmed that it was a baby and not a doll. And I checked Ben Shapiro's Twitter again today, and he's, still had that retweeted that it was a doll. So pretty horrific stuff that you have babies this young being killed and people still trying to deny it. And it was a video of the baby's grandfather holding him that, and they're saying it's a doll. All right, I need to mention again that we started our fundraiser this week. So if you like this show, The only way this happens is through antiwar.com, and we are entirely reliant on our readers, so we have to do these fundraisers a few times a year. This is how we get by, and this is how we're able to maintain our editorial line, is by relying on our readers, and we don't compromise anything, and we remain staunchly anti-war, staunchly non-interventionist, no matter what the conflict. And people get mad at us when new things start, but we are principled and maintain our position. And for that, sometimes we lose donors, and it's always kind of difficult to raise money. So please go to antiwar.com/donate, and you could see the different ways you can support us. Make a one-time donation, special donations, or you could set up a monthly donation. If you have the means, please help us out. Let's get this fundraiser started on a strong foot. We've had so much work to do lately. I mean, I just sort through so much stuff. I hope I've been kind of covering and prioritizing the right stories, because there's just been so much. But again, please help us out. And now to get back into the news, some more Ukraine stuff. Miscalculations, divisions marked Ukraine offensive plans. So this article is from the Washington Post, and they actually published a two-part report on Monday. And I wanted to just run this one today and then run the second one tomorrow. And this one is about the planning that went into Ukraine's failed counteroffensive and the divisions and the things that the U.S. and Ukrainian officials were arguing about. And it's a very long, detailed report. And the link that we put in is to the Microsoft News version of the article, so it has no paywall. So if you want to read the whole thing, you go through antiwar.com to read it. So I just want to scroll down because I actually kind of have some bullets that summarize the article. So Ukrainian, U.S., and British military officials held 8 major tabletop war games to build a campaign plan, but Washington miscalculated the extent to which Ukraine's forces could be transformed into a Western-style fighting force in a short period, especially without giving Kiev air power integral to modern militaries. U.S. and Ukrainian officials sharply disagreed at times over strategy, tactics, and timing. The Pentagon wanted the assault to begin in mid-April to prevent Russia from continuing to strengthen its lines. The Ukrainians hesitated, insisting they weren't ready without additional weapons and training. So they're playing the blame game here. All these U.S. and Ukrainian officials that the Post spoke with are kind of blaming each other for the failure, even though it was clear at the time, just based on the media reports, that the U.S. didn't ever think that Ukraine really had a chance of regaining much territory in this counteroffensive. U.S. military officials were confident that a mechanized frontal attack on Russian lines was feasible with the troops and weapons that Ukraine had. The simulations concluded that Kiev's forces, in the best case, could reach the Sea of Azov and cut off Russian troops in the south in 60 to 90 days. The United States advocated a focused assault along the southern axis, but Ukraine's leadership believed its forces had to attack at 3 distinct points along the 600-mile front, southward toward both Melitopol and Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov, and east toward the embattled city of Bakhmut. And that was another thing that they were arguing about, was that Ukraine wanted to hold Bakhmut. Apparently the U.S. told them to give it up, but they continued to fight that brutal battle for that city in the east. The U.S. intelligence community had a more downbeat view than the U.S. military, assessing that the offensive had only a 50-50 chance of success, given the stout, multi-layered defenses Russia had built up over the winter and spring. So a 50-50 shot is not very good. Didn't sound like there was much confidence from U.S. intelligence. Many in Ukraine and the West underestimated Russia's ability to rebound from battlefield disasters. They're talking about when Russia pulled back in Kharkiv in the northeast and Kherson in the south. When Ukraine gained some territory there, that was when Russia, decided that they weren't going to try to defend it, and they pulled out. It's very different than what they were trying to do in the counteroffensive. So as the expected launch of the counteroffensive approached, Ukrainian military officials feared they would suffer catastrophic losses, while American officials believed the toll would ultimately be higher without a decisive assault. Well, there's also just some nuggets in here. There was one quote from Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that I thought was really crazy. And it was when he was visiting a base in Germany, and he spoke with Ukrainian special operations troops, and he urged them to start attacking, behind enemy lines. Milley told them, quote, "There should be no Russian who goes to sleep without wondering if they're going to get their throat slit in the middle of the night. You got to get back there and create a campaign behind the lines," end quote. So that's the top U.S. military official telling Ukrainians go slit Russians' throats while they're sleeping. It's really something. All right, so the next one here, U.S. official wants to cut Russian energy exports by 50% by 2030. This is another one from Kyle. And U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, Jeffrey Pyatt, people have argued about how you pronounce his name. Pyatt. I say Pyatt, I think. But anyway, if you recognize his name, that is because in 2014, when there was the coup in Ukraine, the leaked phone call with Victoria Nuland, she was speaking to Pyatt, who was the ambassador to Ukraine at the time, discussing who should be in a future Ukrainian government. And just a few days later, the government was overthrown, and the people that they were discussing were in charge of the new government. So this is comments coming from him about U.S. long-term goals for an economic war against Russia, no matter what happens in Ukraine. So he said that basically they're trying to halve Russia's energy exports, energy profits by 2030. So he said, quote, "This is something that we're going to have to stick to for years to come as long as Putin persists this war. We're going to do everything we can to help make that true," end quote. So he stated that the economic war will continue for years, even after peace is reached in Ukraine. He said, quote, "The goal of these sanctions is to change Russia's behavior and to ensure that Putin is not in a position, whenever some kind of peace is achieved, to use 3 or 4 years to rearm and prepare himself and prepare his military for stage 3 of the Ukraine invasion," end quote. So, I mean, it goes to show that, Russia sees this stuff, and that's why we don't see them, they're noticing, I'm sure, that there's this waning support in the West, and they know time is on their side, and they're not rushing to negotiate anymore. They're going to try to wait this out. They're not seeing any goodwill from the U.S., when it comes to future relations. All right, so the last one here. China says a U.S. warship illegally sailed near a disputed reef. So the Chinese military said on Monday that a U.S. warship illegally entered waters near Second Thomas Shoal, a disputed reef in the South China Sea that's been the site of frequent confrontations between Chinese and Philippine vessels. So China's People's Liberation Army said, quote, "The United States has deliberately disrupted the South China Sea, seriously violated China's sovereignty and security, severely undermined regional peace and stability, and seriously violated international law and basic norms governing international relations," end quote. So according to the South China Morning Post, the U.S. warship that made this passage was the USS Gabriel Giffords, and it did so after conducting combined operations with the Philippine Navy in the South China Sea. And Second Thomas Shoal, that is where the Philippines grounded a World War II era ship in 1999 to assert their claims to this area. And just in the past year, there's been a spike in confrontations between Chinese and Philippine vessels, and it's usually when the Philippines try to resupply that grounded warship where they have troops stationed. And there's been a collision between Chinese and Philippine boats. Chinese Coast Guard has fired water cannons at them. And now here comes the U.S. Navy, sailing around it right in the area of all these confrontations. And the U.S. always reminds China, whenever there's any kind of incident like that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. So that means the U.S. has has given a war guarantee to the Philippines if their boats come under attack in this maritime dispute. And it's a major flashpoint for a potential war between the U.S. and China. That is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ron Paul about Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin says non-interventionists are the real enemy. One from Chris Hedges, Israel reopens the Gaza slaughterhouse. One from John Schwartz, on top of everything else, Henry Kissinger prevented peace in the Middle East. One from Ted Snyder, has Volodymyr Zelensky passed his expiration date? One from Mitchell Plitnick, Biden works to create plausible deniability as he backs Israel's assault on Gaza. So that is everything for me for today. Again, please help us with our fundraiser if you can, antiwar.com/donate. You could also help us just by sharing the show, like, subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you watch. If you listen to the podcast version, you could leave a rating or a review. All that stuff really helps out. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.